October 1962. The world is already holding its breath. American reconnaissance planes have photographed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. In our timeline, this standoff became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when the world stepped close to the edge but pulled back just in time. In this version of history, we don't pull back. The turning point isn't a speech or a secret letter or a wise phone call. It's a chain of small human decisions made under fear, pride, and pressure. The kind that feel reasonable in the moment, but in hindsight look like the first domino in a global disaster. It begins with a choice in Washington. In this timeline, President Kennedy approves not just a naval quarantine, but a limited airstrike on Cuban missile sites when early reports suggest some warheads may be becoming operational sooner than expected. The logic is simple and terrifying. If those missiles can soon hit Washington or New York, then waiting is more dangerous than striking first. The decision passes through advisors, generals, and planners who are exhausted, tense, and convinced they're defending their country. At dawn, American jets roar toward Cuba. They destroy several missile sites and kill Soviet personnel on the ground. The White House calls it a surgical strike. But on the receiving end, it doesn't feel surgical. It feels like war. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev hears that Soviet soldiers have died under American bombs. He sees the attack not as a warning shot, but as the first blow of a larger plan that might include an invasion of Cuba and even strikes on Soviet territory. He has his own hardliners, men who insist that if the Soviet Union does not respond with strength now, it will be humiliated on the world stage and lose its credibility with allies. The pressure is intense, the information incomplete, and radios crackle with contradictory reports. In Cuba, Fidel Castro is convinced this is the beginning of a full-scale American invasion. He has been telling the Soviets for days that war is inevitable and that if it comes, they must use every weapon they have. He is not in the mood for restraint. He urges Soviet commanders on the island to fight back with all available means. Then comes the second step in the chain. At sea, a Soviet submarine, already harassed by American depth charges intended as warning shots, receives word that Soviet personnel had been killed in Cuba. The captain believes war has begun. He has a nuclear torpedo on board, designed to destroy aircraft carriers and break blockades. In our real history, a senior officer on a sub like this refused to authorize the launch. In this alternate history, that voice of restraint is absent or overruled. The torpedo is launched. A blinding flash erupts under the surface of the Atlantic. An American destroyer and nearby ships are destroyed. Thousands of sailors die in an instant. The mushroom cloud rising over the water is small by strategic standards, but politically it is enormous. For the first time in history, a nuclear weapon has been used in anger since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Washington, panic and fury collide. Military advisors present the president with options for retaliation. The logic of deterrence, carefully theorized in think tanks, now demands an answer. If the United States does not respond decisively, nuclear threats will mean nothing. If it does respond, the consequences are unimaginable. Yet the window for reflection is narrow, and the pressure to show strength is overwhelming. The decision is made to strike Cuban military and missile targets with a limited nuclear attack, using smaller warheads against air bases and suspected missile locations. The hope, if there is one, is that a controlled use of force will shock Moscow into backing down without triggering total annihilation. Bombers and missiles are launched. Within hours, multiple nuclear explosions tear through parts of Cuba. Airfields vanish, military bases vaporize, and communication lines are shattered. In Havana and beyond, Cuban civilians and soldiers die without fully understanding what has happened. Castro, if he survives the initial blasts, sees his country turned into a testing ground for superpower doctrine. In Moscow, the news hits like a hammer. The Soviet leadership is stunned, but it is not paralyzed. Many of the plans for nuclear war are already detailed, sitting in drawers and safes. Exercises have been run. Targets have been chosen. The command and control system, while imperfect, is ready to move from if to when. Now it's when. Khrushchev and his generals face a choice, but it doesn't feel like one. From their perspective, the United States has used nuclear weapons on Soviet forces and an ally. To respond with anything less than nuclear force would be seen as surrender. Soviet missiles in Cuba are damaged, but those in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are ready. Orders are given. Strike NATO targets in Europe first, including American bases, to blind and cripple the Western alliance, and prepare for a second wave against the United States if war continues. In Europe, night turns to day over multiple cities as nuclear warheads detonate over key military and industrial sites. West German cities near airbases are hit first. American forces in Western Europe are targeted, as are British bases hosting American missiles. Some warheads malfunction. Others miss their targets, but enough find their mark. NATO responds in kind. American and British nuclear weapons strike Soviet troops and infrastructure in Eastern Europe, then military facilities inside the Soviet Union itself. Air defense systems light up the sky, but they cannot stop everything. Within a day, the Central Front in Germany, once imagined as the place of tank battles and infantry clashes, becomes a landscape of craters, burned cities, and radioactive dust. The nuclear threshold, once crossed, erodes quickly. Plans designed to be limited escalate under the chaos of war, miscommunication, and fear. Some commanders launch early, afraid their missiles will soon be destroyed. Others act on misunderstood orders. Communication lines, damaged by electromagnetic pulses and destroyed telephone exchanges, fail at the worst possible moments. Soon, the logic of mutual assured destruction completes its grim work. American intercontinental ballistic missiles fly toward Soviet cities and command centers. Soviet missiles fly toward American ones. Submarines, hiding deep under the oceans, launch their own payloads. The sky over both hemispheres fills with invisible arcs of death. New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, each of them appears on Soviet target lists. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and major industrial hubs in the Soviet Union appear on American ones. Within hours, tens of millions of people are killed. Those near the epicenters are vaporized or crushed instantly. Those on the edges suffer burns, blindings, and injuries in collapsing buildings. Fires rage through cities, merging into firestorms that consume oxygen and create their own winds. The world's great capitals, the symbols of modern power, are reduced to smoldering ruins. But the horror does not end with the explosions. For those who survive the initial blasts, a new reality unfolds. In the first weeks after the war, governments tried to regain control, but many of them no longer exist in any functional form. In the United States, the line of succession is tested brutally. Maybe the president survives in a bunker. Maybe he doesn't. Emergency plans for a continuity of government are activated. Military officers, surviving cabinet members, and regional authorities struggle to coordinate. Food supplies are disrupted, transportation networks shattered, and hospitals overwhelmed. Radiation injuries swell the number of dead, even in places that were never direct targets. In the Soviet Union, the situation is even more chaotic. Centralized planning, already fragile, collapses under the weight of destroyed factories, dead bureaucrats, and broken communication. Local party officials and military commanders become de facto rulers of whatever fragments of territory and population remain under their control. The dream of a unified socialist superpower dissolves into a desperate fight for survival. Europe, caught between the two giants, is devastated. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries have suffered strikes. Entire regions are uninhabitable. Some neutral countries, like Sweden or Switzerland, are spared direct hits, but choked by radioactive fallout carried on the wind. Millions of refugees move aimlessly, searching for food, shelter, and any authority that can offer protection. In many places, that authority is the military, which rules by emergency decree. Beyond the immediate blast zones, the rest of the world looks on in horror and in fear. China, which in 1962 is still on the outs with both the Soviet Union and the United States, suddenly finds itself in a strange position. A regional power that has not been directly targeted, but now exists on a damaged planet. Mao and his inner circle see opportunity and danger. On one hand, their two biggest rivals have been crippled. On the other, the fallout, literal and political, is impossible to escape. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, many of them newly independent, now face a future that no longer revolves around superpower competition, but around basic survival issues: food, climate, trade, and refugees. Some governments collapse under pressure. Others harden into brutal regimes to maintain order. The Cold War, as a structured rivalry between two blocs, ends not in a clear victory, but in mutual self-destruction. Slowly, the effects on the planet itself become visible. Soot from burning cities and industrial centers rises into the upper atmosphere. Sunlight reaching the Earth's surface decreases. Temperatures begin to fall. Harvests fail in multiple regions. Whether or not this is a full-scale nuclear winter in the strict scientific sense, it's bad enough. Shorter growing seasons, confused weather patterns, and widespread famine. In this world, ideology starts to matter less than calories. Governments, whatever their stripes, that can secure food and order have a chance to survive. Those that cannot face riots, coups, or quiet collapse. International institutions, like the United Nations, struggle to function. Many of their headquarters and major members have been hit. A new kind of global politics emerges, one not focused on capitalism versus communism, but on survival versus chaos. Technology and culture also change dramatically. In our real timeline, the late 20th century saw the moon landing, the computer revolution, global pop culture, and the spread of television as a common language. In the nuclear 1962 timeline, much of that is delayed, distorted, or erased. Laboratories, universities, and industrial research centers in many countries are gone. The brightest minds of a generation are dead, wounded, or scattered. Yet humans are stubborn survivors. In some regions less affected by direct strikes, parts of South America, Africa, and Asia cities remain mostly intact. Refugees and skilled workers flood into these areas. New centers of power emerge. Maybe Sao Paulo or Lagos becomes a tech hub decades earlier than in our reality, simply because they inherit desperate talent and the drive to rebuild. Religion and philosophy take on new urgency. People search for meaning in the ruins. Some see the nuclear war as proof of human sinfulness and retreat into strict faiths and closed communities. Others see it as proof that centralized, authoritarian power, whether capitalist or communist, leads inevitably to catastrophe, and they push for more local, decentralized forms of government. Political experiments that were once fringe ideas become mainstream, driven not by theory, but by necessity. The memory of 1962 becomes a global scar. For those who lived through it, the sound of sirens, the glare of flashbulb skies, and the taste of dust become lifelong ghosts. Stories are passed down to children and grandchildren about a world that nearly had it all growing prosperity, scientific advances, a chance to avoid world wars, and threw it away in a handful of days. Ironically, in this devastated world, the dream of nuclear disarmament may finally become real. After the initial conflict and its horrific costs, surviving states have every incentive to ensure such a disaster never happens again. But disarming is not easy when trust is brittle and records are destroyed. Who still has warheads? Who still has working missiles? Who is secretly rebuilding as others struggle just to feed their people? International negotiations, when they resume, are shaped not by abstract discussions of deterrence, but by the lived memory of cities burned and skies darkened. It's hard to argue that nuclear weapons kept the peace when you grew up under permanent cloud cover living off ration cards. By the 1980s in this altered timeline, the world is a very different place from the one we know. There is no global American cultural dominance in the same way. Hollywood is a memory, not a machine. There is no powerful, unified Soviet Union, but perhaps a patchwork of successor states trying to rebuild on contaminated ground. Europe is no longer the wealthy, peaceful bloc at the heart of global trade, but a wounded region, partially depopulated and dependent on imports and aid. The psychological impact is just as deep. In our world, the fear of nuclear war was powerful, but always in the future, always a possibility. In this world, it is a memory. People know exactly what it looks like when the air turns white and the horizon burns. They know what it's like to live for months without seeing a clear blue sky, to watch children grow up smaller, weaker, and constantly sick. The language of politics changes. Every leader who talks about red lines or unacceptable provocations is measured against the ghosts of 1962. And yet, even here, people fall into old patterns over time. New rivalries emerge. Nations compete for remaining resources, clean water, fertile land, access to remaining oil or new energy technologies. The moral lesson of the nuclear war is powerful, but not permanent. Humans forget. New generations, raised on stories but not experience, begin to think we'd never be that foolish again, even as they edge toward familiar cliffs. Looking back at this alternate 1962 from our safer reality, it's tempting to say that such a war was inevitable, that the Cold War was always doomed to end in fire. But the truth is more uncomfortable and more hopeful. In our actual history, individuals made different choices. A submarine officer refused to launch. Leaders accepted compromise instead of pushing for total victory. Messages were sent, back channels were used, and pride was swallowed to avoid catastrophe. The alternate history of a nuclear 1962 reminds us how fragile those choices were and how much depended on them. So when we ask, what if the Cold War turned nuclear in 1962? We're not just playing with a dramatic scenario. We're re-exploring the thin line between the world we know and another world that could have been ours. Darker, colder, and far more broken. A world with the phrase Cuban Missile Crisis wouldn't be a chapter in history books, but the moment when history as we know it ended. And in that contrast lies the real message. The fact that we're here to imagine this scenario means that, at least once, humanity pulled back from the brink. The next time we stand near an edge, nuclear or otherwise, the question is whether we will remember how close we came and how much we stand to lose if the wrong chain of small decisions ever begins again.